Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted. And here we are with a Strefan Maurer Progenitor cheating out Big Vampires deck. This deck comes to us from Rubio, who says the thing they need improvement is draw power. And they have $100 max for upgrades, but it's okay to suggest above budget as well. I don't think we're going to hit that budget too hard, but we're going to see what we can do. As always, this deck list will be in the video description below, and I highly recommend you go take a look. This is a really well-built deck, honestly. I think it's a great example of what you can do with vampires that isn't just vampire tribal. It has a very strong game plan, a lot of synergy. It is a deck I really, really like looking at, and therefore I think this will go rather quickly because a lot of the decisions here are pretty straightforward. But first, let's see who is Strefan, why are we using them for this deck? Well, Strefan is a 3/2, 4 mana vampire noble in red and black. It has flying, and he says at the beginning of your end step, create a blood token for each opponent who lost a life this turn. And then the real reason you're using Strefan is when he attacks, you may sacrifice 2 blood tokens. If you do, you may put a vampire from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking, and it gains indestructible. This is obviously an incredibly powerful thing to do. We are going to cheat on our mana cost to play a very big and powerful vampire, and we want to do this every turn. I think the really funny part, if you haven't caught on, is that when Strefan attacks, you attack one opponent with him, because he has flying, and then you summon another very big vampire, ideally with flying, attacking another opponent. The attacks ideally go through, and then at the end of the turn, that's 2 blood tokens. So Strefan technically enables himself. It's that first trigger of his attack. That's the one we have to enable. However, I think the deck is already built in a way that is very good at enabling that. There's a few selections here that I would like to bring some attention to, but otherwise, I think it's pretty good. Coming down here, if we look at the curve, we've got a pretty good curve. We have a high 6-drop, and in fact, I'm going to suggest more 6-drops, mainly because we are cheating them out into play. So it is fine to look at these and say, well, that's a lot of mana. That's okay. That's our intention. We have 1/7 mana that's also a vampire, and our 9, as always in red, is Blasphemous Act, which is not a 9 mana card. So perfect. Very, very nice curve that is appropriate for the deck. Now, as I said before, this is probably not going to be a particularly long video. I do really like the deck. I think it's really strong. And so I'm going to pick out a few cards that I think are maybe weaker or maybe less powerful than the rest of the deck. So let's go backwards. Let's go from our enchantments up. I will take a moment to talk about lands. We have a particularly high count of basics for a deck of this strength. I think some of that budget, whatever you have left, should be going towards filling out these cards, right? We're missing for sure the check land. I think we're missing the lands that come in untapped if you have enough lands. There's the fast lands. There's the what is it? The battle bond comes into play if you have enough opponents. Luxury suite. I think whatever money remaining, you should be improving your mana base because I think this might be one of the weaknesses of the deck at this point. As the deck itself, as the non-land cards get better and better, the deck needs to rely on the land cards to cast those spells. And when you are unable to cast your spells on curve or with the right colors, you're going to wish for a better mana base. So it's definitely something to consider. All right, let's move through our types. In enchantments, Court of Ambition catches my eye. This is a card that is the same mana cost as our commander, and if you've been watching my videos, you know I don't particularly care for that. I think we should be very, very picky of the cards that share the same mana cost as our commander, and especially in this deck where at least the vampires can be cheated out. However, an enchantment cannot. Chord of Ambition doesn't really do much for you. Yes, it draws you that first card on that turn, but then it goes to upkeep, and you are always going to get the worst of the two. Yes, it does pressure your opponent's hands, but this is 4 mana that takes an entire upkeep to trigger that effect. And even then, most likely you're not Monarch, so you won't get the stronger ability. So instead, you are kind of playing a not so great card. I do understand that this can be used to trigger Strefan to get those blood tokens at end of turn, but I wouldn't count on it because it is not necessarily what's going to happen. I think if you want this effect, playing something like Bottomless Pit, which says on each player's upkeep, they discard a card at random, that's at 3 mana. I think you'd be much happier with an effect like that, where it's just consistent pressure on your opponent's hands. However, that one can discard your really big vampires out of your hand, so I don't know how much you want that or this ability to begin with. So, little critical of that. Stensia Masquerade is a good time. I'm going to bounce around a little. So, Stensia Masquerade, Rakish Air, and to an extent Stormkirk Captain are cards that kind of stick out to me. These are cards that are here to be more of a general vampire tribal card where, attack after attack with your smaller vampires, they're going to grow, they're going to be stronger, and you're going to build a board. However, I don't really see them here. They're a lot of them are very clunky. Like in comparison, let's look down here for Necropolis Regent. Necropolis Regent just flat out boosts all your creatures, vampires or not, on hit, and it does it dramatically more powerful than the other cards. Granted, it is a 6 mana creature, but it is because it's a vampire and a creature, you can cheat it into play and get around that 6 mana cost entirely. Whereas these other ones, Rakish Air and Stormkirk Captain, just adds +1/+1 to first strike, but it's a similar thing, which is why I'm pairing it. Rakish Air and Stensia Masquerade, they don't particularly, they just add one +1/+1 counter. A deck like this, you want to smash with really, really big creatures and do that just a few times and getting ahead on board. I don't think these +1/+1 counters are really going to matter much. One way or another, you are susceptible to board clears, and these kind of cards you're playing that only add one counter at a time, you're just not going to get a lot of use out of them. So I also want to particularly be critical on them, and I would probably take them all out, obviously, with the Necropolis Regent staying because it is particularly strong. All right. Let's come back up here, and I am going to see an artifact. Commander Sphere, once again, this is a 3 mana card. This should really just be, you're in black-red, so ramp is important and difficult to do. So Talisman of Indulgence is definitely the one you're going to want to play. It's a little more expensive. And after that, I would play Felwar Stone, which is another 2 mana rock. It won't always get your colors, but it has a pretty high chance. Oh, you're already playing it. Excuse me. And you are playing that. Okay. Sorry, I just did not use my brain and reading ability, so excuse me on that. But Commander Sphere still probably should go. You're playing the better ones, and I guess the next one to play are the ones that tap for colorless. There's a number you could play that are all just kind of fine, but definitely stronger than Commander Sphere. Bantu's Monument makes sense for its ability, but does still feel kind of weak. If you really want that ability, I think I would suggest playing Pulse Tracker instead, because it is your creature. Yeah, Pulse Tracker is easier to interact with, but it will just trigger much more reliably because it's much easier for you to get an attack through than it is to constantly have creature spells at the right time. I don't know. I guess it's not the hardest thing. The mana cost is really putting me off because this means it does have the perk that when you cast your commander, you do get the trigger. Okay, I'm medium on it. I've waffled back and forth. I'm going to say it's generally fine. Um, Cryptolith Fragment is very, very similar, where I feel like it's just very close to being bad, but because of its ability, it gets a pass. The fact that it comes in tapped does really put me off, but it's not like you're ever going to flip it to its other side anyways, so we don't need to worry too much about that because it's each player and it's just not going to happen. So I think that's perfectly fine. Sword of Light and Shadow stands out as just being kind of a strange inclusion. If I was including one here, I imagined you'd probably want one of the other ones, one of the ones that draw a card, such as the blue-red one, or maybe the black-green one because it untaps all your mana, or the red-green one because that does pseudo draw a card. But the white-black one feels a little strange here because neither the life gain nor the returning a card to your hand is as useful here as others. I do acknowledge that with the blood tokens, you can constantly discard your cards and get them back. And I do recognize that's kind of why a card like Stensia Masquerade is in here. But both of these effects, both the Sword of Light and Shadow and the Stensia Masquerade's ability to make up for the fact that you're discarding a card, is just kind of okay. I think at certain points in the game, you're just holding on to your blood tokens, and you shouldn't be just churning through your deck with them because it's actually a rather inefficient way to get to the cards you need because it is just one card draw and you're looting every time, or I guess rummaging every time. So it's not what I would consider ideal. Looking at instance, I like your collection here. Very, very nice. Urge to Feed, once again, feels a little underpowered because it's just really, really selective. -3/-3 is kind of tough to kill a lot of creatures. It is good. I do recommend Bolt, but Bolt is 1 mana. This is 2 black. So, and you're going to be holding on to this card with the goal of actually getting its full effect off. So I'm kind of medium on it. In the long run, I think it's fine. I think probably if it was like go for the throat, you'd probably have more success, but I don't think it's that different. Again, I'm going to be very critical because I do think this deck is at a very, very good power level. And so I want to look at the cards that seem to just stand out as not just being at the same power level. The sorceries are good. Obviously, Pointed Discussion stands out as a particularly weak card. However, of course, it creates the 2 blood tokens we need. Oh no, a blood token. So it creates half the blood tokens we need, which I do admit is on theme and functional, so that's fine. Otherwise, if you're finding you don't need it as much, Read the Bones is just a superior card for the same mana cost and basically the same ability. All right, creatures. Creatures are almost universally good. I think something like Bloodlord of Vazgoth sticks out as being particularly strange. It is very, very easy to trigger the Bloodthirst, but even then, is this really the creature you want to be cheating into play? I would probably argue no. If you manage to get the Bloodthirst working for itself, it comes out as a 6/6, and then every subsequent vampire grows, but a lot of the vampires you're playing for their abilities and not so much for their raw power. And once again, Necropolis Regent is just better in every way because it represents so much more growing power, albeit a bit slower. Looking a bit lower, I think the other ones that kind of catch my eye. Anger feels kind of weird, but because you have blood tokens, I'm not too picky on it. I wish perhaps a card that we can suggest here that is worth playing is Buried Alive. because once you start playing Buried Alive, I like Anger a lot more because then it's always a guaranteed one of the three cards you pick, and if you happen to draw it, you have a main deck. Your blood tokens are the main way to toss in the graveyard, which I like as well. So Buried Alive, not only does it throw, anger in, you have reanimation effects from Sinister Waltz to, where are you? The Sisters of the Undead, that I think are very much so worth considering. Also, I think down here, Bloodline Necromancer as well. You have reanimation effects, so being able to toss a few of your powerful vampires into your graveyard might as well be tutoring them, and therefore I think is a very good inclusion to have Buried Alive in here. So Anger, I think with that can get a pass, but something I have a harder time having a pass for is Falconwrath Noble and Blood Artist, and to an extent Veto. They just don't feel like they very much belong here. You're not losing creatures that often. These are aristocrat strategies where we are, aiming to sacrifice our own creatures, and then when we're winning, we're either sacrificing, a infinite combination of creatures, where such as the Karmic Guide and Revelar combo, where you are infinitely just resummoning the same creatures and sacrificing them, or we're thinking of like sacrificing 5 to 10 creatures with one or two Blood Artist, or maybe even three Blood Artist effects. You aren't even able to play the Blood Artist effects that are the strongest because you are playing Blood Artist as a vampire. However, Blood Artist itself only targets one opponent as opposed to all your opponents, and I believe Falconwrath Noble also does the same thing. So of the Blood Artist effects, they are in fact the weakest, and I don't think they should be played here. They're just not cards you want on the battlefield. And you have Creeping Bloodsucker here, which is very pricey for a common, but I think that's Jumpstart for you um, in your sideboard or maybe board. And I would just directly put that in instead because it's just going to do what you want far more consistently and probably get the same amount of damage in if you count triggers as a Blood Artist would. If you think about it, even with a board clear where you lose where like 6 creatures die, Blood Artist will do 6 damage total. Whereas for each turn cycle, Creeping Bloodsucker does 3 damage. So that's just 2 turn cycles with Creeping Bloodsucker. Knowing that you get it out on turn 2, people aren't going to remove this creature most of the time. So I think it's going to be very, very helpful to you. Veto Veto's tricky. I can see how Veto could be really, really cool. And Veto's activated ability is nothing to scoff at a deck like this because it does represent quite a large life swing on the right turns. And and I do like that. Once again, the problem is it is target opponent, and there's not a lot of very consistent ways for you to trigger him outside of using his ability. And all that together makes me kind of medium on him. I think like if this is the kind of effect you want, like you want the big life swing, an equipment that gives lifelink is probably just going to be a lot more satisfying, a lot more consistent. I'm thinking Shadow Spear and the like. It's just something you're going to like more. Whereas Veto kind of will come out there and be kind of a drain, honestly. Oh, pun not intended, but it'll be a drain on your mana and your attention because Veto stands there and says, "Hey, you got 5 mana?" And you have to play with that in mind the whole time because you have a turn where you can swing out and let's say deal 14 damage. Veto looks at you and goes, "Whoa, you know that could be 14 life you gain and then an additional 14 damage," which sounds really good, but it is tapping out for your almost your entire like the entire mana for the turn to do this. And sometimes, as cool as that sounds, once again, doing 28 damage and gaining 14 life, it's not necessarily the strongest thing you can do. Whereas sometimes you just want to instead be, putting your board forward, putting out enchantments, putting out artifacts, putting out extra creatures to benefit from, you know, other things you have going on. So at that power level, Veto feels weird. And don't get me wrong, if you're attacking for like 50, then yeah, Veto is fantastic. But if you're attacking on 50, do you really need something to make that stronger? That's just what I have on my mind. Squee's great. It took me a few looks to remember that you're just going to be using your blood tokens on him to basically draw a card every turn. And 1 mana draw card every turn isn't bad. Uh, it's close though. It's close to being bad. I think I think at least with Buried Alive, once again, this will get a lot better because you'll just have a consistent way of throwing him to the graveyard so that you can get him and start the combo. However, there's going to be some hands that Squee, paying an extra mana every turn to use Squee, will just be just barely not worth it. But I don't think that'll be common, so I think it's absolutely playable. I think the rest are pretty good. Uh, Cordial Vampire, I have no problem with, despite the fact that I was very picky about all of our other all of our other vampire lords, because I think Cordial Vampire is just so strong. The fact that it doesn't have to be your creatures that die, it's any creatures that die, and it's your entire board. Cordial Vampire by itself will just grow your board so fast. If I show up with an aristocrats deck and you have Cordial Vampire, you're gonna have enormous vampires just incidentally, and I think that's really good. And notably, a card that would pair very well with it uh, would be Viscera Seer. My friend was very picky on me on reminding that I just can't say Viscera Seer. It's Viscera. So I will maintain the friendship and start saying Viscera Seer. And though often I do suggest playing this alongside our zombie friend that does the same thing, I think this time you can just play the Viscera, almost said it, Viscera Seer, because I think the fact that it's a vampire is cute and it's just fine. I think you're not going to really be using this ability very proactively, but in a few cases it can be good. All right, so what are we missing? Honestly, not much. I'm just going to have a few suggestions here. I don't think anything too crazy. When it comes to card draw, I think you're actually pretty strong. I'm going to suggest 2 pieces of card draw, and then after which, maybe 3, but then after which, I'm going to suggest something else to kind of alleviate it. All right, so the first suggestion is well within your budget and an incredibly powerful card. It's Necropotence. I cannot ever undersell how good or oversell, whichever the one is that I think this card is good. Necropotence is such a good card. It is exactly where you want to be because it constantly says whatever the amount of cards you want to start your hand with, or however deep you want to dig, you can now do that. You will start every turn with at least 7 cards in hand, which I'm a big fan of. And then depending on the situation in the deck, you can dig a lot more. Now, this isn't what I would consider to be a combo deck, so I don't think you're really going to play this and often dig very deep. But I'm the kind of person that if I can get a turn 3 Necropotence, and I think it actually should be pronounced, so what is it? Omnipotence? So is it Necropotence or is it Necropotence? I say Necropotence, but I think it's Necropotence. But regardless, this card, it's all about pronunciations here. This card is just really good at, if I can get it down turn 3, a number of decks, I will immediately pay 15 to 20 life to, sculpt my hand for the rest of the game. You don't need anything that makes your hand size unlimited. You just want to get ahead with the perfect hand for the next few turns. Now, this deck, I think you could probably be fine with, even if you have like 5 cards in hand, paying five the first turn, and then maybe like 2 or 3 each subsequent turn to fill your hand up, and then selectively get rid of a few cards because oftentimes you will have dead cards or weaker cards in your hand, and you are going to be fine to exile them. Now, be aware that this will make your blood tokens exile cards like Squee, But even with that Nambo, I think this card is just so strong and so worthwhile, and I think you should definitely play it. Be aware of it. You won't be able to run 10 whole mountains, which is what I believe you're running. Yeah, you can't run 10 mountains and play Necropotence or Necropotence. Just gonna say Necropotence. You can't run 10 mountains in this card. You're gonna need to replace them with some duels because that black 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 is kind of tough to cast. But once you do cast it, you're gonna feel the power. Another card draw effect that I'd like you to think about. This one's think about because this is one of those better when you're further ahead cards, but still very, very strong. Pact of the Serpent is you choose a creature type, you're going to choose vampire. You choose a player, it's going to be you, and you're going to lose life for each vampire and draw a card for each vampire. I think this is perfectly serviceable. I think there's going to be situations where this is just going to be painful truths where you lose 3 life and draw 3 cards. And I think that's going to be fine. I think that's just reasonable. But there's also going to be situations where you have 4 or 5 vampires and you're pushing towards kind of getting into the lead. Like you've developed your board, but you aren't winning the game immediately. And I think in those cases, this is going to be a very, very strong card where you can just draw 5 cards for 3 mana and then subsequently have the next vampire to throw out of your hand onto the battlefield or have the next interaction spell to get further ahead. So this is definitely something that's not as strong as Pact of the Serpent, but it is rather good. If I was feeling, oh, this card has really gone down in price, then absolutely, I was looking at the 87 card because what a handsome boy. Um, Instead, apparently this is $15 American. So I think you should definitely play Dark Confidant. Dark Confidant is not a vampire, unfortunately. However, when it comes to black card draw, this is the card that really will push you ahead. It is just exceptionally strong. It's in every single one of my commander decks that runs black, which unsurprisingly is the majority of them. It is just so, so fantastic. You're going to play this out early. You're going to be able to draw an additional card. Yeah, you have a lot of 6 drops. The commander decks have a lot of life to bleed. And in fact, because of the large amount of lands, you're going to be able to kind of average out, not losing that much life per turn. And the nice thing of an early creature, as you might have thought, this can also attack one of your opponents and just trigger another blood token early on, which can be incredibly helpful. Yes, it is kind of too bad it's not a vampire, but I think it's absolutely worth playing and well within your budget. Then, the next thing I'm going to say about card draw. I think you could probably get away with playing a few tutor spells because realistically, you're not looking for always a number of cards. You are often looking for the right card. Having Strefan early and then being able to cheat in Nirkana Revenant is such a boon because from that point on, you are getting double mana from your swamps. I think that's a really, really strong thing to do. To be able to throw out, let me see. Even things like Crossway Troublemakers or Butcher of Malakir early and have like a commanding, advantage so early in the game is just going to be really, really good. Or, for example, when your commander has been hated out of the game by Drannith Magistrate or something, being able to tutor for Sorin Imperious Bloodlord and then use his -3 to immediately put the vampire into play, I think is also going to be very, very relevant. So which tutors to play? Well, when it comes to budget, cards like Profane Tutor are probably the best place to start. It's a very fair tutor. It actually gives you a little bit of leeway to have the time to figure out which card you want to play, which is an underrated feature of it. I'm saying feature, it's the only way to make sense of the suspend cost, but it is true. Otherwise, after that, Diabolic Intent. Diabolic. There we go. Is a particularly strong one as well because it always puts, though you have to sacrifice a creature, it just got reprinted. It'll put the card straight to your hand. Pretty good. Outside of that, you can play Gamble as well because you are in the colors for it. And then if you really wanted to, the obvious, more expensive option is Vampiric Tutor, with it being on flavor, and being the cheapest one. Otherwise, the one other one that might be worth considering, depending, is Entomb, just because it is very, very good and works well with your reanimate cards, and you can use it to entomb either Squee or Anger. And if you're looking for maybe the price is honestly that price is really, really good. I am going to put it on to my I would like to buy this card list because I didn't realize it was so cheap. Must have been it was just reprinted Dominaria Remasters. Okay, good to know. But the other one is Unmarked Grave, which is the same thing for 2 mana. Just can't get legendaries, but can get any other card that's not a legendary. So considerably cheaper, but also double the mana and at sorcery instead of instant speed, but still worth considering. Okay, so those tutors are the things that I'm thinking about. I think two other cards I just wanted to put out there, just because recently I've been thinking about them. Haunt of the High Tower is noticeably missing because though you can't get that initial trigger when you cheat it into play, the ability for this creature to grow so quickly is really frightening, honestly. This is a card that was almost, they talked about making it weaker and at a lower mana cost. I think it would be a playable mono black commander at that case. But at 6 mana, it's just a little too much. However, cheating into play, starting to discard your opponent's cards, gaining tons and tons of life. Like, I think if you've ever played that 5 mana green black Vulturous zombie, I believe it's called. It's this giant flying zombie that says whenever a card goes any into the graveyard from anywhere with your from your opponent's decks, it gets a +1/+1 counter. If you've played with that, you know how strong this card is. This card will grow exceptionally fast. And even if you hit with it 2 or 3 times at because that first attack when it comes around, that first attack is like 3. The second one, when we've done a turn cycle, I could easily see this being 6 or 7. And after that, you're attacking with like a 10 or a 12 power creature. That is a lot of life you can gain incredibly quickly. And this deck has means to pay and use that life, especially since I've suggested Necropotence, Dark Confidant, and Pact of the Serpent. Having that extra life is going to be really, really nice. And I do think this is the kind of legendary creature that can really take over a game if left alone. And that's the kind of theme here is that our creatures that we want to cheat into play, they should really just be threats completely on their own. And I think Haunt of the High Tower definitely exists that way. The other one I just wanted to say, I don't know if it's a right inclusion, but recently I was looking at a black red or mono black, I think, vampire deck. No, it was Elenda, so it was black white. But I had to suggest to cut Timothar because Timothar, though being really, really, really cool, is just so much mana and does so little and really, really is kind of a bummer. But here, it's not even a little bit of a problem. In a deck like this, Timothar comes out really, really easily, is really strong, and you're able to hold up the mana to use his ability, which you can then use to great effect. Because Timothar is really, really good when you are getting back really big vampires. And as you might imagine, your vampires are really big, and therefore you're going to get the full advantage out of this. So up to you. This is another vampire that you can drop off of your commander that if your opponents leave alone will kind of define the game going forward, which is definitely something that we want. And I think that's where I'm going to end it. I think these are pretty good things to start with. I hope this has been helpful. I really like the deck. I think it's built in a way that is really, really satisfying, and it is close to being almost complete at the power level it's at. There's always going to be a few changes here and there, but I think these cards are my suggestions are the things that will help. Obviously, I just don't have very many suggestions because the deck is so complete. And the cards that I've pointed at, I hope you understand why I picked them as being not as strong in your deck, so that you can think about them while making cuts. After that, I think I'll reiterate my point. Whatever budget you end up having left over, you should really think about your lands and what you can do to improve them. I think you're really close to having a strong deck and having the fact that you have 20 basic lands out of your 35 lands holding you back is very, very fixable. It's something that you can go ahead and change, and I think the deck will get considerably stronger when you do so. So don't let the lands hold back your otherwise very, very strong deck. If you'd like to send me the next draft of this deck or any draft of a deck, there is a link in the video description below. And if you'd like to skip the lineup and have it so your deck is the next deck I work on, there is a link down there for that as well. And as always, if you would like to comment, subscribe, like the video, any of those things, it is incredibly helpful. The more I learn about YouTube's algorithm and, strange practices, the more I realize that when you do these things, it really does matter. It really doesn't feel like a big thing you're doing, but it does really improve the channel. All right. I'm really, really excited by this deck, and I almost want to build it because of how fun it looks. So I really do want to hear how it works out for you. And yeah, good luck.